Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name's Simone Vecchio with Hello Neighbor. You might ask why we're doing all this, but Hello Neighbor has a new program. It's called Keystone Connections. It's a mental health and wellness program specifically for refugees and immigrants. And this is part of a partnership that we have with USCRI Erie and also the Nationality Service Center in Philadelphia. So we were asked to record a training video, and we thought this would be a perfect opportunity. So today we're going to be talking about language access and give you some really good information, useful information about language access, what it is, the legal basis of it, some tips for working with interpreters, and best practices. And I also want to turn it over and introduce Holly Hickling with the Global Switchboard. And this is really a partnership between Hello Neighbor and All for All with the language access training.
So I'm going to just step over here just for a second. Hi, everyone. I'm Holly Hickling. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Switchboard. We run the All for All Coalition, which is a coalition in the Pittsburgh area of organizations that serve immigrants and refugees. One of our projects is language access training, helping different organizations learn how to work with interpreters and translators so they can be more welcoming to immigrants and refugees. So at the end, we're going to ask you guys if you have any other organizations you would love to refer this training to. And obviously the video, when it comes out, will be very useful for, hopefully lots of more people across the state. Another project of All for All is the mental health, cross-cultural mental health roundtable. Can you raise your hand if you're part of that? Thanks for coming, Erin. Yeah. But I would like to welcome any of you who are interested in including immigrants and refugees in your mental health work. We have a monthly meetup for that's over Zoom, and it's just to kind of exchange information and resources and troubleshoot problems and do referrals and things like that. So I'm very excited about this, and I'll leave the rest to you.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. So we're going to be talking today about language access as language justice. These are some terms that you definitely will hear if you're, scheduling for interpretation services, if you're really kind of researching and knowing and learning about language access in the field that you're in and working with immigrants and refugees and how to better serve them. Today's workshop objectives, we have quite a few to get through here, so I feel like this is a really comprehensive training for everyone, especially if language access is new to you. So we're going to be talking about what language access is and why it's important, the legal basis for language access, the modalities of interpretation, the standards and best practices, what language access resources are available to you, and then also how to work with interpreters. So we like to always give some local data just so that people have an idea of who is here in our community. And this is just very brief. This is not the whole picture, but these are some of the top 3 languages in our region right now: Spanish, Nepali, and Arabic. And we've broken this down by southeast and southwest neighborhoods. So it's just a little snippet of Pittsburgh. But you may have already encountered some clients speaking these languages. You may have encountered some other languages. Arabic is a pretty big language here in Pittsburgh now. Also Dari and Pashto. We have a really large and growing Afghan community. Swahili is another pretty prominent language in our region. But these are really the top 3. And this kind of gives you an idea of how it's dispersed throughout some of these neighborhoods. And then here's your southwest neighborhoods. You can see South Park is pretty much all Nepali speaking in terms of the refugees and immigrants that are in that area. And then you see, sorry, go back for a sec. And then you see Spanish, of course, is a pretty large population of our immigrant and refugee speakers. Here's a couple of other languages here: Arabic, as I mentioned, and then Uzbek. Uzbek has actually for the last, I'd say 4 or 5 years, also been a growing community as well. We have a lot of Uzbek people who are here for the diversity lottery, or the green card lottery as it's often referred to, but that's another growing community. Okay, go ahead to the next slide, please. So this is a video that we actually created within All for All about maybe almost 2 years ago now. It's a video that we designed and put together to really just kind of talk about some of the struggles that immigrants and refugees and people who don't speak English or don't communicate in English experience here in our community. So if you want to go ahead and play the video.
Language access is what makes a community richer. I'm Lais Alexander. I work for the Global Switchboard and I manage the All for All Coalition.
Yo soy Araceli Romero. Tengo 15 años viviendo acá en Estados Unidos y 8 aquí en Pittsburgh. Realmente no sé. Por ejemplo, para encontrar una clínica para mi salud, doctores que hablen español. Yo soy diabética y necesito estarme chequeando diferentes partes del cuerpo, mis ojos, diferentes especialistas. Ahora yo he encontrado una clínica y ahora en este momento hay personas que hablan español o por medio del teléfono ponen un intérprete, pero realmente yo no sé cómo haría para encontrar um intérprete.
Todos os dias, todo o tempo. Desde precisar comprar um remédio para dor, até precisar fazer o pagamento de uma conta, explicar para o médico o tipo de atendimento que eu preciso, entender o que o médico me explica, que é o mais triste para mim, mais difícil para mim. Eu me sinto uma presa, eu me sinto vítima, porque eu estou à mercê de precisar, talvez, de uma boa fé. Emanuele Azevedo. Sou brasileira, nascida no estado de Minas Gerais. Eu moro aqui na América tem 3 anos. Eu tenho 42 anos, sou solteira, tenho 2 filhos.
समस्या त मलाई यहाँको भाषा नबुझ्दाखेरि धेरै नै समस्या भएको हो। बसमा चढ्नु नि समस्या, सपिङ गर्न जानु नि समस्या भएको हो। अनि अब ठुलो समस्या चाहिँ मलाई एकखेप बसमा हराएर एकचोटि चाहिँ म एयरपोर्ट पुगेको थियो राति 9 बजे राति कामबाट आउँदा डाउनटाउनदेखि हराएर एयरपोर्ट पुगेको। त्यस पछाडि चाहिँ अब छोराछोरी अलिक जान्ने यहाँको भाषा बुझ्ने इङ्ग्लिस जान्ने भएर अलिक समस्या हट्दै गएको थियो। एन्ड फेरि पछाडि छोराको मृत्यु पछाडि चाहिँ मलाई एकदमै समस्या ठुलो भयो इन्टरभेटबाट। छोराको बारेमा चाहिँ ठुलो भन्दा त ठुलै मलाई समस्या भएको हो। एकदमै अब इन्टरभेट पनि आफ्नै मान्छे मैले बनाएर राखेको थिएँ मैले हैन, कोर्टमा धाउने यता बोल्ने आफ्नै मान्छेलाई मैले इन्टरभेट चोइस गरेर मैले कोर्टमा देखाएको थिएँ। तर त्यो इन्टरभेटले पनि मलाई धोका दियो। त्यो छोराको सकिएर पनि उसको केस पनि डिसमिस भयो। यसमा चाहिँ मलाई ठुलै धोका लागिरहेछ, समस्या चाहिँ यसमा लागेको छ मलाई। अनि अब त्यस्तै हो, अहिले पनि मलाई त्यतिकै समस्या भइरहन्छ। अब यस्तो फोनमा बोल्नु, अब के कता हिँड्नु पर्यो भने पनि मलाई एकदमै इन्टरभेट चाहिँ जहिले नै चाहिरहन्छ, चाहि नै राखेको हुन्छ। अब छोराछोरी छ तर स्टुडेन्ट हो, 2 जना छोरी छ साथमा। तर स्टुडेन्टलाई अब बोल्नु मिल्दैन, उनी स्कुल छुट्टी मागेर बस्नु मिल्दैन। त्यो भएर मलाई फाल्टै मान्छे चाहिँ जहिले पनि इन्टरभेट चाहिँ चाहिन्छ। बोल्दाखेरि अब मलाई त्यो बोल्ने टाइममा इन्टरभेटसँग बोल्दा ठिकै लाग्छ मलाई। तर त्यही हो, अब मेन कुरो चाहिँ मलाई धोका चाहिँ त्यही हो। अब छोराको समस्या, छोराको बारेमा, एक कोर्टको बारेमा चाहिँ आफ्नै मान्छेले मलाई त्यस्तो गरेको चाहिँ। फाल्टो मान्छेले त अहिलेसम्म त्यस्तो झुटो कुरा त बोलेको छैन। मेरो नाम हर्का भगवान, अमेरिका आएको 2014मा 11को 14 डेटमा। अनि अहिले बसोबास चाहिँ मेरो बलुइङ।
Language is mainly bring us together or connect with us. We talk about food connect us, music, yes, all of that. And language, even the language through food, even the language through music and art and work. That's what make us feel part of a group, a community.
So I want to just pause here for a moment and talk a little bit about this video, and just really ask all of you what stood out to you that you heard in the video, what resonated with you. Yeah.
The justice component of interpretation and the ability to use language, that it can really be a make or break in terms of someone feeling as if they receive any justice and care, whether it's doctor's appointments or even just or in the legal system.
Sure. Great. And, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but that's a really great point, because there was a difference between when an interpreter was provided to her, professional interpreter, versus someone she brought. And we'll talk about the use of professional interpreters more. Anybody else? Anything that struck you? What about some of those like really basic, simple things? You know, can you imagine going to the grocery store and having so much trouble because you can't speak the language, or just trying to get somewhere to take a bus? I mean, she took the wrong bus and ended up at the airport because she didn't have the language. So I think sometimes it's things like that that we don't think about, the very simple things. We're really good at thinking about like the big picture, the major stuff, you know, as it relates to our jobs and our services that we provide. But even just those very little things, those daily life things, are really a struggle for people. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about specifically about language access and what it is, give you some of the legal basis behind it. But language access, if you go to the next slide, are services that help to facilitate communication between people who don't speak the same language. Seems pretty simple, seems pretty straightforward. There's a lot of different components to language access. It's not just the words, it's also the cultural meaning, the culture behind it. And we'll talk about that also a little bit later. But it provides non-English speakers with reasonable access to the same services as English speakers. So it makes the services that we offer not only more available, but also more equitable for people, regardless of what language they speak or what country they come from. And then language justice, when it boils down to it, it is social justice. We talk about it in those terms. This is a quote that I always like to include. It might be a little bit hard to see with the white print, but this is from the Language Justice Initiative, which is a nonprofit out of Richmond, Virginia. And it says that language justice is about building and sustaining multilingual spaces in our organizations and social movements so that everyone's voice can be heard, both as an individual and as part of a diversity of communities and cultures. Valuing language justice means recognizing the social and political dimensions of language and language access, while working to dismantle language barriers, equalize power dynamics, and build strong communities for social and racial justice. I really love this quote because I always like to include it. I feel like it really sums up this idea of language access as language justice, as social justice. And I think some of the important things here to really pull out of it is that when you're providing language access services for someone, when you're providing interpretation, a way for them to communicate, you're letting their voice be heard. You know, they have their voice back. And what that's also doing is it's equalizing the power dynamics for them. It's giving them the power to make decisions for themselves about their health care, make decisions about their families, and really be able to participate fully in things like service plans and their health care. So I think that that's just so important to really keep that frame of reference in mind. So why provide language access? Language barriers and linguistic isolation decrease the quality of life related to many, many, many things. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but there's a lot of research to back this too, that when people do not have English or their English levels are very low, their access to safe and affordable housing could be non-existent or compromised. Their access to quality health care. There's a lot of healthcare disparities, as I'm sure a lot of you know. A lot of research behind that. Their ability to hold a job and earn a fair wage. It's proven that the more English somebody has, the higher wage they're going to earn. When refugees arrive here in that first 90 days, as a refugee resettlement agency, we're finding them employment, which can be very difficult when they don't have English. A lot of times they come here with really, good skills. They might have degrees, PhDs, they might be doctors, but if they don't have the language and they don't have the credentials or the means to get re-credentialed, they're not able to utilize their skills and their talents. And often they're ending up in very lower paying jobs at the bottom that need minimal English to work. Access to public benefits and programs. Achievement of legal status such as citizenship. Even if a person has a pathway to citizenship, they may not be able to get their citizenship because they may not be able to have enough language to pass the test, to take the exam. And then access to and participation in education. At All for All through the Global Switchboard, we have another campaign. It's a Know Your Rights for Education. And we try to educate refugee and immigrant parents about their children's rights to education. It's very difficult for them to communicate with schools, and often they don't know what their rights are. And then also, of course, social inclusion and well-being. And that's really one of the core functions of the wellness program that I spoke of earlier at Hello Neighbor. When a person does not speak English or can't communicate to their neighbors, they become more socially isolated. And that's really important too, and that's becoming, I think, increasingly prevalent in Pittsburgh because it used to be easier for resettlement agencies to set up pockets of immigrant communities. We were able to do that because housing wasn't such a problem. But now housing is such an issue in Pittsburgh, and affordable, safe housing, that refugees that arrive and immigrants are spread out across Pittsburgh. They're no longer able to really establish these own communities of support that they used to have. It still exists, but it's becoming less frequent. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the terminology. There's a lot of different terms that you'll hear that refer to people who don't communicate in English or who have limited English, such as LEP, limited English proficiency. You're going to hear that a lot. That's still in the legal jargon, in the laws. It's in a lot of the research. It's just the term that has commonly been used. But you'll see a lot of these other things like ELL, English language learners. Not everybody is able to learn English. You'll see English as a second language. English is not always somebody's second language. It could be their third, their fourth. Non-native speakers of English. We try not to use that term native anymore, especially in this respect. Dual language learners might not necessarily be dual language. All of these terms just don't apply. There's no one size fits all. And what we try to do is we try to keep it asset-based. The term limited English proficiency, even though it's what's widely used, really implies a deficiency. And we don't want to speak about refugees and immigrants in that way. We don't want to highlight their deficiency. So we want to keep it asset-based, keep it simple, and don't make assumptions about people. We can't assume that somebody has enough English just because maybe they're able to say a couple of key phrases, but we also can't assume that they're not capable of learning English. So we try to say either a person who doesn't communicate in English, a non-English speaker, or simply refer to them as a speaker of what their language is, a Swahili speaker, an Arabic speaker. So why should we provide language access? Why do we need to do this? Well, plain and simple, the bottom line, it is the law. And if there's one thing you take away today, it should be that. It is the law. So the law states that all federal government agencies and those receiving assistance from the federal government must take reasonable steps to ensure that LEP individuals have meaningful access to the programs, services, and information those agencies provide. So that means all programs and operations of entities that receive direct funding, but also those who are subrecipients are also required to comply with the law. So state agencies, local agencies, private, nonprofit organizations, and then of course the subrecipients. This is what the law says, and this is actually the definition from the government. It's a government definition. There are two main laws that really protected the rights. There are some things in between, but these are the two big ones that I really would like you to know about. Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which said no person in the United States shall on the ground of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So it says right there, you not only can you not provide the services, but you also can't discriminate. So it was able to address the discrimination aspect of it. The Civil Rights Act, great. What it says is great, but it's still a little bit vague. It doesn't really tell organizations what or how to do it. And we all know sometimes laws are subject to some interpretation, no pun intended. But also there's no governing body over this that enforces it. Yes, it's the law, but nobody enforces it. So unless somebody wanted to file a lawsuit, there's no interpretation police. There's no language access police. And then the second big law was the executive order, which was issued in 2000, Executive Order 13166. And this talked about improving access to services for persons with limited English proficiency. So this required now organizations to actually look at providing it. So it attempted to give them a little bit more structure on how to do that by examining the services they provide, identifying any kind of needs, identifying what resources they already had, and then developing and implementing a system to be able to adequately and sufficiently provide language access. There were a few different points to consider with this particular executive order and how to go about doing that. The first was to consider the number or proportion of non-English speakers that are served in that organization's eligible service population. So, what's the number of people you see? What's that proportion in relation to your total clients for the year that you see? The resources that are available to you, what do you have right now? Do you have multilingual, bilingual staff? Do you have access to interpretation agencies? Do you have maybe contracted interpreters, volunteer interpreters? But also, what are the burdens of compliance of all of that? Because we know that interpretation services are very expensive, but also there's knowledge gaps. It can be really hard in an organization to make sure everybody is on the same page about language access when you have really big organizations where there's high turnover or people changing jobs and positions all the time. It can be difficult to keep up with. And then the nature and importance of the program, activity, or service. So what your organization provides, how essential, how important is it to that population? And then also the frequency with which people come into contact with your organization. Are you seeing a Spanish speaker maybe once or twice a year? One person once or twice a year? Or are you seeing people consistently coming through your door every month or every day? The frequency can also help determine the appropriate level of services and certainly cost as well. Does anybody have any questions before we move into modalities of interpretation? Anything about the law I can answer? No? Okay, we'll move right in. So modalities of interpretation, we're going to talk about next. And the modality, if you want to go to the next slide, simply means how the language is delivered. So it can be the verbal, it can be the written. But when we talk about modalities, we can really kind of split it into two pockets. interpretation and translation. A lot of times people interchange the two, but there is a distinct difference. Interpretation is the verbal or the spoken changing of the words from a source or language of origin into the target or the finished second language. Translation is generally referred to as the written part of it. So the writing, the reading of something in one language and converting it to another. With interpretation, there are 3 different types of interpretation: face-to-face or in person, which is almost always the best practice and really is what should be preferred. There are some situations where it doesn't call for an in-person interpreter, like just making a simple phone call or sending a reminder to a patient. But for the most part, if a client is coming in for an appointment, you should have an in-person interpreter there. There are 2 different types of face-to-face or in-person interpretation. There's simultaneous and consecutive. So simultaneous is continuous interpreting, and that's not what we generally use in our work. Simultaneous interpreting, an example of that would be a press conference, and you see if I had an ASL, American Sign Language interpreter, standing right beside me interpreting as I'm speaking, that's an example of continuous or simultaneous. Press conferences where you'll see interpreters with the headsets on because they're listening to whatever that speech is, and then they're immediately interpreting it into whatever that second language is. Simultaneous interpreting is an even more specialized skill than consecutive. It's also much more expensive because you have to give interpreters a break after so long, 30 minutes to an hour of speech, and then you have to bring in another interpreter. So you don't just need one, you need more than one. So it can be very, very expensive. And as I said, it does require a much more specialized skill. Interpreters are specifically trained for that, so it's not easy. The type we use most frequently, though, is the consecutive, which is the stop and start. There's a segment of speech that is spoken. There's a pause to let the interpreter then take that in and then be able to verbally speak it in the target language. Stop and start. As I said, in person is almost always the best practice. However, with in person, it can limit an interpreter's ability to take more jobs because it does take more time, and there's only so many interpretation appointments an interpreter can take in one day. But the reason why this is really preferred is because interpreting is more than just the verbal words. It also includes people's body language, eye contact, tone. There's a lot more that's just involved than the words. And if you have an in-person interpreter, the in-person interpreter is able to see that body language and interpret that as well. Body language can be really important because sometimes that might be the way to tell that a patient doesn't understand something. A lot of times patients or clients might not want to say that they don't understand something, so they'll just say yes, or they'll agree, or they'll shake their head. That's not always a sign that whatever you're speaking about is understood. So body language can help with that. Then we have over the phone interpretation, or phone, OPI. I think that's very obvious what that is. And then video remote, VRI. Video remote interpreting, that became very, very popular and widely used during COVID when a lot of appointments switched to video. It's stuck around in a lot of fields. Hospitals, I think, probably still use some video remote. Maybe some doctors' offices do. Telehealth, of course. So it's really big in healthcare settings. Not so much in some of the service provider organizations like resettlement agencies. At resettlement agencies, we pretty much use the in-person or phone if it's just making a quick call to a client to remind them of something, to tell them to come to the office, to reschedule an appointment. But those are the 2 that we primarily use. And then translation. Translation, of course, is the written part of interpretation, interpreting words. So translation is a little bit different than sight translation. And I want to explain the difference between those because you may very well need a sight translator. So sight translation means that an interpreter is interpreting the written materials by reading it and then simultaneously translating it into a spoken target language. So an example of that is a patient in a hospital. Nurse comes in and says to the interpreter, here's some discharge paperwork. Can you please read this to the patient? So the interpreter has to go through all of that. Generally, an interpreter will take a look, see if there's any kind of words that stand out that maybe don't have a direct translation or meaning, anything that's questionable, ask for that clarification before he starts reading it. Do you need me to interpret all of this? Do I need to read every page? Are there certain sections? Is everything necessary? And then verbally speaks that to the patient. Any questions about that? Yeah.
For site translation,
Mhm.
does the interpreter have to be there in person? I'm thinking of youth that we would work with that maybe has an IEP. Could the
Yeah.
interpreter be emailed records or documents?
Yeah, I would say that's fine. I would make sure you don't need in person for anything else in that appointment. If there's a lot of times when interpreters are at hospitals, if maybe it was an inpatient job, a lot of hospitals will require the interpreter to be there day and night, and they'll take shifts. They'll always have coverage there, not only for the patient but also for the family. So often the interpreter's already there. But for something like that, if you don't need the interpreter for anything else, then I would say, yes, that's perfectly acceptable. Make sure they have the document ahead of time. The other thing that's really, I think, a good practice or habit to get into is if you have an interpreter site translate something, if you're present there with the interpreter, have them sign it, date it, or make sure you write their name, because depending on your requirements, if you're monitored, you have to submit reporting or case note things, it's important to have that documented that you had an interpreter there for it. Because otherwise, if, I'll give the example of a resettlement agency, we get monitored by, by our VOLAG. And when they come in and they don't see that we've case noted that we used an interpreter, the interpreter hasn't signed whatever the form was or the document, then it didn't happen. We may have very well used the interpreter, but if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So just to cover yourselves, I would say make sure that you write that down, have the interpreter sign it, case noted if that's what you do as a practice, but it's really important to do that. And also, if a client is required to sign any documents, it's always a good idea to have the interpreter site translate that, because you never want to give a client a document and say, here, sign this, this is what it says, and just give them like the gist of it, or give them a vague idea of it. If they should be signing it, it should be site translated to them word for word. Yeah. The other thing too that I was going to say about translated materials is you should have translated materials. If you have anything that does require a patient or a client's signature, it should be translated into their language so that they can read it for themselves. They have a copy of it. Any kind of vital documents should be translated. Yes, it can be costly, but it's an investment. And once you have it translated, then it's done. You always have that to use. But keep in mind also that there are some clients, some people who may not be literate in their own language. There are some languages that don't have a written form. So site translation may be your only option. You're only going to really know these things by understanding the language or knowing a little bit about the language, and also about the patient or the client's abilities. What is their level of understanding? So we're going to talk about some standards and best practices. So interpreters are really critical to mental health care in general, for a lot of different reasons, but these are really some of the big picture ones. To help ensure that patients are receiving accurate and complete information, and can understand their diagnosis, treatment options, and risks and benefits in order to make informed decisions about their care. We talked earlier about that quote that said you're giving people their voice back, you're giving them the power to make decisions for themselves. To build trust and rapport between patients and providers. If a patient trusts you, they're going to open up to you more. If they don't trust you, they may not want to tell you how they're feeling. They may not want to tell you the symptoms they're experiencing. To help reduce stress, anxiety, and fear, and also avoid re-traumatization. This is a really important one, especially when working with refugees and immigrants. just, you heard from the video, the woman who lost her son, and it sounds like she's constantly living through that kind of re-traumatization of losing her son, but also the court case being dismissed was like another hurtful blow to her. And that is a form of re-traumatization that she's experiencing over and over again. And then also to understand cultural differences and avoid potentially harmful cultural misunderstandings. There is a huge, big cultural aspect to interpretation. When we train interpreters, we do a whole training session just on the culture of interpretation, because interpreters really have to have a foot in both cultures. They have to be able to understand both to interpret what's not being said. Mental health conditions can manifest differently in different cultures, and interpreters can help providers understand the cultural context of a patient's symptoms, and that can lead to more accurate diagnosis and, of course, treatment. And then also to overcome barriers to access mental health care and advocate for patients' rights by ensuring that they're treated fairly and with respect. So, there's a lot of other tools and things out there and people out there who can sometimes help out with interpreting, but they're not best practices. So we talk about, why can't I just use a friend, a family member, a child, a teenager, a bilingual colleague? Why can't you just rely on those people? These are some of the big reasons: confidentiality, bias, language ability, accuracy, emotional context. And we're going to get into those just in a few minutes. When you're not using a professional interpreter, there's a lot that can be misinterpreted. And especially in the healthcare field, that's a really big risk. And that can open yourselves up or your organizations up to liability. So the use of untrained and non-professional interpreters could also violate HIPAA or any confidentiality policies that you have. Some providers do require a paid interpreter. So they can't just say, oh, you brought your English-speaking friend, sure, we can use them. Some providers are not able to do that. In-person and professional interpretation improves outcomes. There's so much research based on that. All you have to do is Google it and you'll find a bunch of articles. People might overstate their language abilities because everybody wants to be helpful. That is human nature. And if someone is overstating their abilities and they say, oh yeah, I know English, yeah, I can do this, or I know French, I can do this. You don't know the language, so how do you know that they're being accurate? How do you know how good their language skills are? And so because of that, you don't have any confidence in their reliability. Bias, sometimes intended or unintended, implicit bias, we call that. Sometimes people are biased and don't even realize it. Sometimes they do. Of course, if you have a family member interpreting, they're going to want the best and they're going to want the most for their family member. So yeah, they're going to be a little bit biased, and that can affect the services and also affect the appointment. Untrained interpreters might be inaccurate because maybe they don't know how to interpret something because there's no direct meaning or there's no direct translation into the other language. And they may not know enough, not being trained, how to get past that, how to reword something, how to ask for something to be reworded or rephrased. They might alter, omit, or embellish words. Again, that's also human nature. You give somebody something to read and they may switch it around a little bit, or they might skip over some words. If I tell you something and say, repeat this back to me, unless you have like a sharp mind and you can say everything I said word for word, and it is the same language, you might not necessarily get that all correct. You might change it around a little bit. And then important also is that family and friends should really be focused on the person and their care. They should never be put to work in a situation like that. All right, so Google Translate. Oh, where do I start? It's okay. It's not great. There is computer-assisted technology for interpretation and translation. It's called CAT technology. something similar to Google Translate, not the same. CAT technology, like professional interpretation agencies, will use that. So they may take a translation request, run it through that CAT technology, but then any professional agency worth their, worth a dime is then going to have an actual human person read over it to make sure that nothing was translated wrong, to make sure that the cultural nuances are picked up and explained, to make sure it makes sense. Because sometimes translations are done and what's translated just doesn't even make sense. I mean, I've encountered that before. I've had somebody do a translation that I thought was a professional translation. I give it to somebody else or I give it to a client and the client says, this doesn't make sense. Like, this doesn't even exist in our culture. So you have to make sure that, you're covering all of that you're not forgetting about that cultural component of it. Google Translate can't really do that. Google Translate is good for some languages, like it's not so bad for Spanish. Spanish is pretty decent for, but it's horrible for other languages, and it should never be solely relied on. If it's maybe a quick text message that you want to send to your client or your patient, or you just need to make a quick phone call about a reminder, you can probably get by with it. What I would suggest, though, is that you do the translation of it front and back. So go from French to English and then English back to French, making sure that they match or that they make sense. It's the more common languages that are better. AI, I don't have enough experience with AI in terms of interpretation to really be able to answer that. Give it a test. If you have somebody maybe on your staff who is fluent in another language, test it out, have AI translate it, and then give it to that person and say, here, can you translate this? And then compare them and see how good they are. You can always do something like that. But short translations help for unexpected needs, but it will have limited cultural understanding. And then just beware of any kind of idioms and expressions that don't translate well. And with that being said, anytime you're preparing something to be translated, try to use simple language. Keep it simple. For a lot of reasons, the whole translation into another language and things not always having a direct meaning, that's one. But also sometimes the more complex something is, the more difficult it is for clients to understand it. So try to keep your language very simple and straightforward. So some language access standards. Yes, I want to say use only qualified, trained professional interpreters. If you have the resources to do this, yes, this is what you should do. Be the one to inquire about language support that people need before they ask for it. If you have a new patient that comes in to see you in your office and you know that English is not their first language, maybe they have a little bit of English and they can communicate with you, still ask them, what is your preferred language? Sometimes people will say it's English because sometimes people just want to practice it. They want to get better. They want to force themselves to use it more. That's fine. But again, if you're having, some sort of conversation with them or appointment where it's going to be a lot of complex terminology or ideas or concepts, then you should still have an interpreter there. That's okay. They can, you can try speaking in English, but if you sense that they're not understanding, then you've got the interpreter there for it. But making sure you're asking, what language do you speak? What's your first language? And you can ask people, what do they feel that they need an English interpreter? Let's just keep one here. Do you speak any other languages? Because sometimes that can be really helpful. They might speak 3 languages and you've got them scheduled for an appointment and you can't get an interpreter for their first language. There's just not one to be found. But if you know their second language and they speak it fluently enough, then you can get an interpreter for that second language. You have more options. Individuals should never be encouraged to provide their own interpreter or to turn down language services. So if you're making the appointment and they say, that's okay, I'm going to bring my sister, she speaks English. Well, that's great. Your sister can accompany you to the appointment. We'll still have an interpreter here for you, though, just in case. Or you can flat out tell them. I mean, it depends, too, I think, what your policies are, but you can tell them, that's okay. We will use our interpreter. You don't have to bring your sister. Or, you can bring her, but she doesn't need to interpret. Individuals should be made aware of their rights. It really, we'll get to, I think, some of the resources, but it really is a good idea to hang a language ID chart in your offices. The idea with a language ID chart is that people can look, point to their language, and then you would know what type of interpreter they need. Most of the time, though, people are able to tell you what language they speak, most of the time. And a language ID chart is not really going to be helpful if they're not literate. And then we already talked about providing translated versions of vital documents, especially anything requiring a signature. When it's not feasible, have the site translator present and document it. And then ensure that all employees understand both the why and the how, why it's important to do this and how to do it. So what resources might be available to you all? Professional interpreters and translators. There are contracted interpreters that essentially work for themselves. Sometimes they may work for themselves plus work for a professional agency. Generally speaking, an interpreter is probably going to work for multiple agencies. Pittsburgh is small enough that by working for one agency, unless it's a very popular language, they may not be able to get enough work through one agency. So don't be surprised if you get an interpreter from one agency, then you get it for another, and it ends up being the same interpreter. That happens. Phone and video interpretation, which we talked about. If you're using video interpretation, some professional agencies can set up the links for you. Some of them you can just set up your own and send them the link, you know, if you do it by Zoom or Teams or whatever you use. Train bilingual staff or community volunteers. I'm extremely strict about this, that any person who is going to interpret, whether it's staff or a volunteer, has to be trained. We at Hello Neighbor, we do a pretty comprehensive 5-hour workshop for professional interpreters. Those are for our contracted. We have a scaled down one for volunteers, and then we have a separate required training for staff. Even the staff that don't speak another language, they're still required to take a similar training like you all are to understand all of this and know what resources are available to them and also how to find interpreters when they need them. I would never recommend using volunteers who are not trained. I think it just really leaves too much up for debate and too much up to chance, really. Training for staff, we talked about that. And then the visual supports, we mentioned the language ID posters. Usually with those posters, generally like the top 15 languages in the region are what you would put on those posters. There's lots of versions of them available to download. I know the city of Pittsburgh used to have one. They might still have it. But you can just download one from the internet and edit it with your languages. And then I Speak cards. These are great. There's also a lot of versions of these. The city I know has them as well. Sometimes organizations do their own. UPMC has them. And they basically are just little like business card size cards for people to carry around with them that say, hello, my name is, I speak whatever language. Can you please get me an interpreter? Some will even have a space for on the back that says, if you need more information, please contact my service coordinator or my case manager, and it will have space for their name and number. We try to give those to our clients, especially our newly arrived, so that they can take those around with them. Very helpful. And then a language access plan. We talked about with that executive order, the criteria and the structure that's set up for organizations to help develop their language access services. A language access plan can help do that. There are professional interpretation agencies who will come into your organization and they will look at everything. They will basically audit your services, your staff, the clients that you have coming in to see, you know, what you're dealing with, what populations you're serving, what your services are, how frequently are they accessing those services. And then they'll draft a language access plan with recommendations for best practices, for things that your organization can do to enhance your language access services. All right, so how to work with an interpreter. These are just some tips and some hints. I just want to ask, how many people have never used an interpreter before? Okay, all right, so it's probably about half, or maybe a little bit more than half. Well, you're going to learn. Don't be afraid of it. I know for the first time, it can be a little bit daunting, but trust me, just believe me, you will get used to it, and you'll be more comfortable with it. So when you're working with an interpreter, next slide, please. So it's best if you can brief the interpreter ahead of time. If you're scheduling an interpreter through another agency, sometimes those agencies will ask you, what type of appointment is this? That can be really important for the healthcare sector because it gives the interpreter an idea of what's going to be discussed. And a lot of interpreters will do a little bit of research. Like they'll just look up some keywords, if maybe, the patient just had like a shoulder surgery or had a hip replacement, they might look some terms up so that they're not like caught off guard when they're in the assignment. But sometimes interpreters will have to pause and look things up right then and there. That's completely normal. But if you can give them a little bit of information ahead of time, that lets them know what to expect. Allow for extra time because interpretation is going to lengthen your appointment. So if your appointment normally you think would be an hour long, I would probably add an extra 30 minutes onto it at least. If it's something that's going to involve a lot of paperwork, site translations, you're going to need a lot more time than that. Okay. Use triangle positioning. It's the preferred positioning, and I know it's probably hard to see, but there's a little diagram above there. All that means is that people are sitting in a triangle so that everyone can see each other, and that's important because of the body language. You want the interpreter to be able to see the client or the patient and the provider as well. There are some schools of thought where people feel that the interpreter should not be seen, just be heard, and so they'll put the interpreter back behind the client or the patient. Well, if the interpreter's sitting back there and off to the side, they can't see that body language. They can't see those facial features. They can't make eye contact. And then there's some people that will put the interpreter and the provider right next to each other, and then the patient's across from them. Well, what does that say about power dynamics? That's 2-on-1, and that can be really uncomfortable and isolating for the client. So the triangle, I think, is the best. Allow the interpreter to introduce themselves. We call this setting the stage. Professional interpreters are trained to do this. Setting the stage is basically a script that they can kind of adjust, but it covers certain points. An example would be, hello, my name is Simone, and I will be your French interpreter from Hello Neighbor. You may not think that that's important to say that. Like, let's just assume, yeah, I hired a French interpreter. Well, there are times that the wrong interpreter has showed up for the wrong language. And you want to make sure you catch that before everybody starts talking and then the client looks really confused. So hello, my name is Simone. I'm your French interpreter from Hello Neighbor. I will interpret everything you say exactly as you say it. So if there's something you do not want to be repeated, please do not say it. I will adhere to all confidentiality, privacy, however they may phrase it, or they might say, I will adhere to your HIPAA regulations. And they'll say, I may ask you to slow down. I may ask you to pause. They might use hand gestures, time out, just to ask for clarification. Please speak directly to each other. That's a really important thing. And I think we will get to that point. But you always want to make sure that when you're using an interpreter that you're not saying to that interpreter, could you please ask her, or could you tell him? You want to talk directly to your client as if the interpreter's not there, as if you are having a direct conversation and we're speaking the same language. Because otherwise, if you're saying, ask him, ask her, tell him, tell her, that is very isolating because you're talking about someone. You're not talking directly to them. Yeah.
I would also add, sometimes the interpreter asks for a repeat. The interpreter didn't quite follow.
Yep.
And then repeat it as if speaking directly to the client.
Yes. definitely. And a lot of times when interpreters need to interrupt and pause for something like that, they will say, interpreter wishes to say, because that lets everybody know that the interpreter is speaking now for themselves, not for the client, not for the provider. Interpreter wishes to say, what you just said does not have a direct meaning. Can you rephrase it a different way? Or I'm going to ask the client for clarification because I'm sensing that she doesn't understand. So may I do that? And then the interpreter will ask the client, hey, we just want to pause here. We want to make sure that you're understanding. But the interpreter should always say, interpreter wishes to say. And so then the interpreter, once he finishes saying that, say they're saying it first to the provider. Then he'll say, okay, now I'm going to repeat the same thing to your client. And then the interpreter will turn to the client and say the same exact thing in French, the same script. So what that setting the stage does is it puts everybody on the same page, lets everybody know how that encounter is going to go. It sets up some ground rules. And then it also lets the client know who's the interpreter and who's the provider. Because believe me, clients get confused. They have so many people working with them. Sometimes they'll think the interpreter is the provider or is their case manager. It happens. So it keeps everybody on the same page. It also lets the interpreter be able to manage the flow of the conversation. Because we always say that the provider manages the content of the communication, the interpreter manages the flow of the communication. And the interpreter may need to slow things down. The interpreter might need to interrupt you and say, can you pause for a moment? Like, that was enough. I need a moment. They may write things down. Even me, I've been using interpreters for years, and sometimes I have a habit of talking really fast, and I'll have to catch myself and say, oh, I better stop. Because it's just, again, human nature. You have a tendency to just keep going on and on. So you have to get yourself used to that. And it can be difficult, just like any other habit. Make sure you are speaking clearly and in a normal tone. You don't need to speak louder. You don't need to speak slower. You just need to speak normal. Again, as if there was no language barrier. Pause often, preferably every 2 to 3 sentences. And then avoid any sort of idioms, expressions, slang, metaphors, acronyms, and jargon. Anything that just, is like our slang or something we say that is probably a cultural thing. Try to avoid that, because believe me, people will not understand what that means and they'll get confused. Okay, next slide. So some tips for success. As I said, speak directly to the client and make eye contact. But know that in some cultures, eye contact is not appropriate. Eye contact can be a sign of disrespect. So if you're going to be seeing a new patient who maybe is, and I'm totally making this up, but a patient who is Bhutanese, maybe you might just want to read a little bit about the culture of the people, and just to understand that, number one, they come from collectivist cultures. Number two, they generally do inform the whole family in decisions, even about someone's health. And see what this says about eye contact. Is it appropriate to make eye contact? Because in the US, in our American culture, we make eye contact. We're very direct, but sometimes that can be offensive. So you just really kind of have to get to know a little bit about your client. Avoid those side conversations. Again, that can be isolating, making people think that you're talking about them, so avoid that. I will say too, just beware that you may say something that is like a simple sentence, or like 1 or 2 sentences. And now the interpreter has gone on for like 3, 4, a minute or 2, and it seems like it's going on and on and on and on. That doesn't necessarily mean there's extra conversation going on, but sometimes what we say very quick and short could be longer in whatever that target language is. So just be aware, it's not always equivalent. Be aware of your body language. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
To add, it's been my experience, depending on the quality of the interpreter, I think, that sometimes they get to decide conversation, and I can tell because they're going back and forth, and then what gets repeated to me is like, thank you, ma'am. And so I have,
Yes.
at least for me, it takes a little bit of courage to say, going back and forth with it. Can you tell me more about what was said?
Yeah.
And then they'll say, oh, this and this, because it helps me get more
Sure.
cultural understanding and
Sure.
sensitivity.
And that's not appropriate for an interpreter to be doing that. So if that was going on, I would, if it was me, I would say, that sounded like a lot of extra conversation. I need you to not have side conversations with the client. Even if the client just says to you, if you're not even prompting it, but the client just starts talking to you about something, I still need you to interpret that for me. Because here's the thing. You ask a pretty simple question and now this client has gone on and on and on and on and on. You don't know what they're saying. That could be a symptom of something. That could be disorganized thinking. That could be that they can't concentrate or focus. That could be that they've now talked about some other issue that's important to them other than what you've asked them about. So there's still insight in that and it's still valuable. That's why we train interpreters to say, you have to interpret everything that is said exactly as it's said. So if an interpreter is doing that, I hope that you would feel empowered to say something. And hopefully after just one time saying something, that they're not going to continue to do it. And they may say, I'm sorry, she's talking to me, or she's asking me these questions, or she's telling me about her home, or, whatever. And some of that, can be rapport developing, but there's a place and time for that, not in the middle of that interpretation encounter. Okay. We always train them, don't have side conversations. Okay. But that's a great point. So be aware of that body language and other nonverbal communication. We call that paralanguage. Language is actually only about 7% of what you say. So this is why it's so important for everybody to see each other. The other 93% is called paralanguage. And there's this rule of communication, 738-55. You can look that up too. But it says that 55% is delivered by body language, 38% by vocal signals like your tone, and then the last 7% is delivered by the words themselves. So be aware of cultural nuances. Be aware that, there is a culture to everything. You might end up saying something that ends up being culturally offensive that you're not even aware of. Again, a professionally and trained interpreter should correct you on that and say, just want to let you know, try to avoid using that word. That is offensive in our language. And then permit one person to speak at a time. This is really important because it's very difficult for an interpreter to be able to listen to multiple voices at one time. It's already hard enough for the interpreter to get everything that's said. But when multiple voices are talking, it's even more difficult. Acknowledge if you have to keep the interpreter past their time. Most interpreters probably can stay. It's not that they need permission to do so, but they might have a job coming up. They might have back-to-back jobs. It's great if they can stay because then it means you don't need to schedule another appointment. You don't need to get another interpreter. But if they absolutely can't, can you finish it on the phone? Can you get a phone interpreter on the line? And maybe that's the way to continue it. So you have to kind of think about some of those things. And then arrange your technology ahead of time and be familiar with it, especially if you are going to do VRI or if you're going to do phone and you need to do phone conferencing. Our cell phones, you can add a call. Make sure you know how to do that though. Be sure you have a space that's free from distractions and background noise. The quieter, the better. It's very hard to interpret in a loud space. Again, all those voices. Sometimes out in the community can be hard when there's a lot of overstimulation. It can also be hard for clients to focus when it's like that. And then double check that the interpreter speaks the language and dialect of your client. So not just the language, but the dialect is really important too. Sometimes we'll schedule an interpreter and then we find out they can't really understand each other because there's a difference of the dialect. It can make a huge difference. And then don't be afraid to ask for another interpreter if needed. If that interpreter is really bad, remember, you're probably paying for that. So, give that feedback to the agency that you're using. They want that feedback. Believe me, they want that feedback. And there are times when I've had a phone interpreter who's been horrible, or maybe the connection has just been so bad and I can tell wherever that interpreter is, they're in a loud, noisy room or they've got kids screaming in the background. I can't work like that. I can't expect my client to work like that. So I'll hang up, get another interpreter. But make sure that you report that because you're probably still going to get charged for that. If you report it, most agencies will take that off. They won't charge you for it. Okay. Next slide. So we're at the end here, and these are some resources. We have a wonderful language toolkit that Global Wordsmiths has put together. Global Wordsmiths is an external interpretation provider. They're also one of our partners in All for All. They're a great partner of Hello Neighbor. They have amazing services. They're a female-owned business. I can't speak highly enough of them. There are also some other really great local interpretation agencies, so I encourage you to look into them. But Global Wordsmiths put together this toolkit, which has a lot of helpful resources and things in it for you. And then DHS has an I Speak booklet. That's another resource for you. Frequently asked questions at the top. You're also, next slide, please, free to contact Holly if you have any questions. Again, if you're interested in doing a train, doing a train the trainer training and becoming a trainer for this, please contact Holly. We would love to have you on board because, you know, we developed this a couple of years ago with the idea that we would be offering this free training to, you know, every sector, education, healthcare, local governments, you know, everything. So we really want to get it out there. And then if you all could take a moment, and Holly has emailed you the survey. We would love it if you would just take a couple moments now and do the feedback survey on this training, what you thought of it. And with that, I think I will thank you all for being here. I'm so glad you all came. And if anyone has any other questions, I am happy to answer. Oh, yeah.
So I'll stand close to Simone so the mic picks me up.
Okay.
Thank you for taking the survey. One of the questions is about other organizations or entities that you think need this training. And I would love to have that information. And you could send it to them if you have a relationship, or we can also do the outreach. But there's also like a place to give any other comments. So thank you so much for filling out that survey.